Section 1 of the Golden Web. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Book 1, Chapter 1, A Life for Sale. The contrast in personal appearance between the two men, having regard to their relative positions, was a significant thing. The caller, who had just been summoned from the waiting room and was standing before the other's table, hat in hand, a little shabby, with ill-brushed hair and doubtful collar, bore in his countenance many traces of the wild and irregular life which had reduced him at this moment to the position of suppliant. His complexion was pale almost to ghastliness, and in his deep-set sunken eyes there was more than a suggestion of recklessness. He was so nervous that his face twitched as he stood there waiting, and the fingers which held his hat trembled. His lips were a little parted. His breathing was scarcely healthy. There was something about his whole appearance indicative of failure. The writing upon his forehead was the writing of despair. The man before whom he stood was of an altogether different type. His features were strong and regular, his complexion slightly bronzed, as though from exposure to the sun and wind. He had closely cropped black hair, keen gray eyes, and a determined chin. He sat before a table on which were all the modern appurtenances of a business man in close touch with passing events. A telephone was at his elbow. His secretary was busy at a smaller table in the corner of the room. A typist was waiting respectfully in the background. His confidential clerk was leaning over his chair, notebook in hand, receiving, in a few terse sentences, instructions for tomorrow's operations. Stirling Deane, although he was barely 40 years old, was at the head of a great mining corporation. He had been the one man selected for the position when the most important and far-reaching amalgamation of recent days had taken place. And this although he came from a family whose devotion to business had always been blended with a singular aptitude for and preeminence in sports. Deane himself, until the last few years, had played cricket for his county, had hunted 2 days a week, and had by no means shown the whole-hearted passion for money-making which was rife enough in the circles amid which he moved. He wound up his instructions and dismissed his clerk with a few curt and final words. Then he turned round in his chair and faced his visitor. "I'm sorry to have kept you, Rowan," he said. "This is always rather a busy day in the city at a busy time." His visitor, who had been waiting for an hour in the anteroom, and was then esteemed fortunate to be accorded an interview, looked around him with a little smile. "So you've prospered, Deane," he said. "Naturally," the other answered. "I always meant to. And you, Rowan?" The visitor shook his head. "I have tried many things," he said. "All failures. Disposition or luck, I suppose. What is it, I wonder, that keeps some men down while others climb?" Deane shrugged his shoulders. "Disposition," he said, "is only an appendage, and luck doesn't exist. In 9 cases out of 10, if a man's will is strong enough, he climbs." Rowan nodded gloomily. "Perhaps that's it," he assented. "I never had any will, or if I had, it didn't seem worth while to use it." "Take a seat," said Deane. "You don't look fit to stand. What can I do for you? We shall be interrupted in a few moments." "I want something to do," Rowan said. "I can't give it to you," answered Deane, firmly but not unkindly. "You don't beat about the bush," the other declared, with a hard little laugh. "Why should I?" Deane asked. "It would only waste our time, and be, after all, a mistaken kindness. There isn't a man about my place who hasn't grown up under my personal observation. It's an important business, this, Rowan. I daren't risk a single weak link. To be frank with you, and you see I am being frank, I'd sooner pay your salary than have you here." "Give me a letter to someone else, then," Rowan begged. "I'm just back from Africa, broken." "I can't do that," Deane answered. "I know you well. I like you. We have been friends. We have been together in difficulties. More than once you have been in a way useful to me. I have every disposition to serve you. But you were never made for business or any form of regular work. I would not offer you a place in my own office, and I cannot pass you on to my friends. What else can I do for you?" Rowan looked into his hat and laughed a little bitterly. "What the devil else is there anyone can do for me?" he demanded. "I can lend you some money," Deane said shortly. "I shall take it," Rowan answered, "but it will be spent pretty soon, and I doubt whether you'll ever get it back. I want a chance to make a fresh start." Deane shook his head. "I can't help you," he said. "Not in that sort of way, at any rate. If you wanted to settle down in the country, I'd try and find you a place there." "No good," Rowan answered. "I want to make money, and I want to make it quick." The telephone bell rang, and Deane was busy for several moments answering questions and giving instructions. Then he turned once more to his visitor. "Rowan," he said, "you talk like all the others who come down into the city expecting to find it a sort of El Dorado. I can do nothing for you. How much money shall I lend you? Stop," he said, holding out his hand. "I don't want to seem unkind, but I'm a busy man. I don't want to lend you £10 today, and have you come and borrow another £10 next week, and another the week after. You and I went through some rough times together. We've heard the bullets sing. We know what a licking was like, and we shouted ourselves hoarse with joy when the good time came. I don't forget these things, man. I don't want you for a moment to believe that I have forgotten them. Ask me for any reasonable sum and I'll give it to you. But afterwards we shake hands and part, at any rate so far as the city is concerned. You understand?" Rowan leaned forward in his chair. He wetted his dry lips nervously with his tongue. The look of ill health in his features was almost painfully manifest. The writing, which it is not possible to mistake, was on his face. "Look here, Deane," he said hoarsely, "don't think I'm ungrateful. You've put the matter straight to me like a man, and if needs be, I'll ask you for a good round sum and go, and I'll take my oath you'll never see me again. But listen, I'm in a bad way. I was in the hospital last week, and they told me a few things." "I'm sorry," said Deane. "You shall go away and recuperate. When you're feeling stronger, you can think about some work." Rowan shook his head. "That isn't it," he said. "I'm a sick man, but I'm not that kind of invalid. I have somewhere about 12 months to live, no more. I want, somehow or other, before I die, to make a little money. I don't want a fortune, nothing of that sort, but I want to make just a little." "You have a wife?" Deane asked quietly. Rowan shook his head. "A sister, poor little girl. She's wearing herself out typing in an office, and I can't bear the thought of leaving her all alone with nothing to fall back on." Deane drummed with his fingers upon the table. His manner was not unsympathetic, but betrayed the slight impatience of a man of affairs discussing an unpractical subject with an unpractical person. "My dear Rowan," he said, "don't you see that your very illness makes it absurd to imagine that you can take a position and save any amount of money worth mentioning in it in 12 months? The idea is absurd." "I suppose it sounds so," Rowan admitted. "But listen, Deane. You know I have many weak points, but I'm not a coward. I like big risks, and I'm always willing to take them. The doctor gives me 12 months. That means, I suppose, about 7 months, during which I shall be able to get about, and 5 months of slow torture in a hospital. I mention this again so that you can understand exactly how much I value my life. Isn't there any work you could put me on to where the risk was great? The greater the better, but if I succeeded, I could make a reasonable sum of money. Think." Deane shook his head. "My dear Rowan," he said, "we are not in Africa now, you know. We're in a civilized city where life and death have no other than their own intrinsic worth." "You are sure?" persisted Rowan. "I don't mind what I do," he added in a lower tone. "I've lived in wild countries, and I've lived a wild life. My conscience is elastic enough. I'll take on anything in the world which meant money. You have great interests under your control. You must have enemies. Sometimes there are enterprises into which a man in your position would enter willingly enough if he could find a partner who would be as silent as the grave, and who would risk everything I mean that, not only his life, but everything on the chance of success." Deane shook his head slowly, and then stopped. A sudden change came into his face. He had the air of a man absorbed with an unexpected thought. A flickering ray of sunshine had come struggling through the dusty window from the court outside. It found its way across Deane's desk with its piles of papers and documents. It rested for a moment upon his dark, thoughtful face. Rowan watched him eagerly. Was it his fancy, or was there indeed a shadow there greater than the responsibilities of his position might warrant? End of section 1. Section 2 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 2, The Purchase. Deane looked across the room towards his secretary. "Give me 5 minutes alone, Ellison," he said. "And you, Miss Ansell there, see that I am not interrupted." The young man got up at once and left the room, followed by the typist. Deane waited until the door was closed. Then he turned once more to his visitor. "Listen, Rowan," he said. "Do I understand you rightly? Do you mean that you would be willing to undertake a commission which you would certainly find unpleasant and perhaps dangerous?" "I do mean that," Rowan declared, beating the palm of one hand with his clenched fist. "I am a desperate man. I have no time for long service, for industry, for perseverance, for any form of success which is to be won by orthodox means. I am like a man who has mortgaged every farthing he has in the world to take a 35-to-1 chance on a number. Don't you understand? I want money, and I can't wait. I haven't time. Give me a chance of something big. Remember what I have told you. 12 months of suffering life is worth little enough in the balance." "You misunderstand me a little," Deane said slowly. "What I am going to suggest to you may seem difficult enough, and, under the circumstances, unpleasant. But there is no actual risk. At least," he corrected himself, "there should be none." Rowan laughed scornfully. "For heaven's sake, don't pick your words so carefully," he begged. "If the thing is big enough, I'm not afraid. If it is dishonest, say so. I'm not a pickpocket, but I am past scruples." Once more Deane was silent for several moments. It was a chance, this, just a chance. He looked out of the window and seemed to see in swift panorama all the splendid details of his rise to power. He saw himself as the central figure of that panorama, respected, honored, envied wherever he went, east or west. It was a life, his, for a man to be proud of. There was no one who had a word to say against him, no one who did not envy him his rapid climb up the great ladder. He carried power in both hands, so that when he moved, even amongst the great people of the world, a place was found for him. He realized in that one moment what it might mean to lose these things, and he drew a little breath. He must fight to the end, make use of any means that came to his hand. It was a chance this, only a chance, but he would take it. "Listen, Rowan," he said, turning once more to the man who had been watching him so eagerly. "I am taking you at your word. I am believing that you mean exactly what you say." "God knows I do," Rowan muttered. "Very well, then," Deane continued. "I want you to understand this. The company of which I am a managing director owns, as you may have heard, the greatest gold fields in the world. Our chief possession, though, is the Little Anna Gold Mine, which was once, as you may have heard, my property, and for which the corporation paid me a very large sum of money. Did you ever hear anything of the history of the Little Anna Gold Mine, Rowan?" Rowan nodded. "It was a deserted claim which you and some others had a shy at. Dick Murray was one of them. That brute Sinclair put you on to it." Deane nodded. "You have spoken the truth, Rowan," he said. "It was a deserted claim. 4 of us took possession, but the other 3 never knew what I knew. I bought up their shares one by one. I won't go into the matter of law now. I simply want you to understand this. The mine grew and prospered. What it has become you know. I sold it to this corporation, as I wished to have no outside interests, and the price paid me was close upon £1,000,000 sterling. 3 days ago in this room the man whom you have just spoken of, Richard Sinclair, produced documents and tried to convince me that he was the real owner of the Little Anna gold mine, that it had never been deserted, and that our taking possession of it was nothing more or less than an illegal jump. Rowan was plainly amazed. "But it was Sinclair," he exclaimed, "who gave you the tip." Deane nodded. "That," he said, "may have been part of his scheme. He hadn't the money or the patience to work it himself, and it may have occurred to him that if he could get someone else to do all the work, believing that they had acquired the mine, it might be worth his claiming afterwards. I have weighed it all up," Deane continued. "I have been to some mining lawyers, and I have spent a small fortune in cabling to the Cape. The conclusion I have come to is this: if Sinclair prosecutes his claim, and he means business and goes to law, there is just a reasonable chance that he might win." "A reasonable chance?" Rowan repeated. "It isn't only that, though," continued Deane. "There are other things to be taken into consideration. We don't want a lawsuit. Several of our smaller mines are doing rather badly just now, and we have been spending an immense amount of money upon developments. Any suspicion as to the validity of our title to the Little Anna mine would be simply disastrous at the present moment. Our shares would have a tremendous drop just at the time when we are least prepared for it." "Where do I come in?" Rowan asked quietly. "Sinclair," Deane said, "has only been in the country 3 days. He has no friends. He drinks most of the day, and he is staying at the Universal Hotel, where I imagine that he spends most of his time at the American bar. Now I can't treat with the fellow, Rowan. That's the trouble. If I were to show the least sign of weakness, the game would be up. My only chance was bluff. I laughed in his face and turned him out of the office. But bluff doesn't alter facts. You and he are old acquaintances. I know very well that you never hit it off together, although I never knew what was the cause of your quarrel. However, there's nothing to prevent you going to see him. He's in that sort of maudlin state where he'd welcome anybody who'd drink with him and let him talk. That is where you come in, Rowan. You can drink with him and listen. Find out whether this is a put-up thing or whether he believes in it." Rowan nodded. "Anything else?" he asked in a low tone. "There is no reason," Deane continued, "why you should not, if he gets confidential, open up negotiations on your own account." "He has some documents, I suppose?" Rowan asked. "His claim to our mine," Deane answered, "is contained in a single paper, which he told me never left his person. You were a lawyer once, Rowan. You know how to argue, to handle facts, to make a bargain. The return of that document to me would be worth £10,000. Rowan's breathing seemed suddenly to have become worse. His lips were parted. There was a strange glitter in his eyes. £10,000, he muttered. "It is a great deal of money, I know," Deane said, "but understand this, Rowan, once and for all. If this enterprise appeals to you, you must undertake it absolutely and entirely at your own risk. Above all things, it is important that neither Sinclair nor anyone else in the world should ever dream that I have been behind any offer you might make, or any course of action which you might pursue. All that I say to you is that I am willing to give £10,000 for that document." "£10,000!" Rowan muttered. "It would be enough, more than enough." "If you fail," continued Deane, "and find yourself in trouble, I know nothing of you. I shall not raise a finger to help you. I demand from you your word of honor that you do not mention my name, that you deal with Sinclair simply as a speculative financier disposed to be his friend. Remember that the slightest association of my name with yours would give him the clue to the whole thing, and would mean ruin here. On the other hand, before you go, if you tell me that you are going heart and soul into this enterprise, I shall give you £500. Some of this you will need for clothes. to make a presentable appearance, and to be able to entertain Sinclair and play your part as a capitalist. If you fail, you can keep the balance as a loan or a gift, whichever you like. Now, you can take your choice. I am placing a good deal of confidence in you, but I think that I know my man." Rowan struck the end of the table with his hand. "Yes, you do, Deane," he declared, looking at him with kindling eyes. "You do know him, indeed. If I were to die to morrow, Dick Sinclair is the one man in the world I should die hating. He served me a shabby trick once, and I've never forgotten it. Perhaps," Rowan added, "perhaps I may now turn the tables upon him." "No mention of my name, mind," Deane repeated emphatically. Rowan held out his hand. "I take my chance, Deane," he said, "and on my honor I'll play the game." End of section 2. Section 3 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 3, A Family Affair. A few hours later, Stirling Deane sat at a small round dining table, side by side with the father of the girl to whom he had been engaged for exactly 3 days. His hostess, the Countess of Nunneley, and her daughter, Lady Olive, had only just left them. It had been a dinner absolutely a familia. "Draw up your chair, Deane, and try some of this port," Lord Nunneley said. "Thank you," replied Deane. "I'll finish my champagne if I may." "Just as you like," his host answered. "I notice you are very careful never to mix. Deane, perhaps you are right. There's nothing like being absolutely fit, and you fellows in the city must have a tremendous lot on your minds sometimes. I suppose, however prosperous you are, you never have a day without a certain amount of anxiety." "Never," Deane assented quietly. Lord Nunneley, who had a great reputation as a peer of marked sporting proclivities, crossed his legs and leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette. "I never thought," he continued, "that I should be glad to give Olive to anyone, you won't mind if I say it, outside our own immediate circle. Of course I know your people were all right. I've ridden to the hounds with your father many a time, but when a family drifts into the city, one naturally loses sight of them. You will find me a model father-in-law, though, Deane. I never borrow money. I wouldn't be a director of a public company for anything in the world, and I haven't a single relation for whom I want a berth." Deane smiled. His manner was natural enough, but only he knew how difficult he found it to continue this sort of conversation, to keep his attention fixed upon the somewhat garrulous utterances of his prospective father-in-law. "You are very wise to steer clear of all that sort of thing, sir," he said. "The city is no place for men who have not been brought up to it, and the days of guinea pig directors are over." Lord Nunneley nodded. "My lawyers have been making inquiries about you to day, Deane," he said. "You insisted on my doing so, so I let them, although it was more for your satisfaction than mine. According to their report, you seem to have rather underestimated your position. They tell me that yours is one of the richest corporations in the mining world, and that you yourself are very wealthy." Deane inclined his head slowly. He leaned across the table and helped himself to a cigarette. A few nights ago he would have listened to such a speech with a feeling of genuine satisfaction. Now everything seemed changed. The rock upon which he had stood seemed to have become a shifting quicksand. Dick Sinclair was a blackmailer and a thief, he told himself, with a fierce desire to escape from the shadow which seemed somehow to have settled upon him. The document he had brandished was not worth the paper it was written on. His attack, even if he ventured to make it, could prove no more venomous than the sting of an insect. Yet the shadow remained. Deane, for the first time possibly in his life, felt that his nerve had temporarily gone. It was all that he could do to sit still and listen to his companion's easy talk. "Of course I'm glad enough for Olive to marry a rich man, especially as her tastes seem to run that way," Lord Nunneley continued. But I tell you frankly that I shouldn't have fancied a marriage for money pure and simple. I'm not a wealthy man, but I can keep my places going pretty comfortably, and I don't know the meaning of a mortgage. Olive will have her $1,000 a year settled upon her for life when she marries, and something more when I die. In a sense it's nothing, of course, but it will help pay for her frocks." "I am sure you are very generous," Deane murmured. "I had not even considered the question of dowry, so far as Olive was concerned." Lord Nunneley nodded. "As I remarked just now," he went on, "I should have hated the idea of a marriage for money pure and simple. I have seen you ride to hounds, Deane, as well as any man I know, and there's no one I'd sooner trust to bring down his birds at an awkward corner than you. That sort of thing counts, you know. I always meant to have a sportsman for a son-in-law, and I am thankful that your city life hasn't spoiled you for the other things. By the way, how old are you, Deane?" "I shall be 40 my next birthday," Deane answered. His host nodded. "Well," he said, "you won't want to go wearing yourself out making more millions, surely. Why don't you retire and buy an estate?" "I have thought of it," Deane answered. "I mean to take things easier, at any rate, after my marriage." Lord Nunneley sipped his wine reflectively. "I have never done a stroke of work all my life," he remarked, "beyond looking after my agent's accounts, which I have never been able to understand, and trying a little scientific farming, by which I have invariably lost money. I do respect a man, though, who has been through the mill and held his own, and against whom no one has a word to say. At the same time, Deane," he added, "don't stick at it too long. If you'll forgive me mentioning it, you don't look quite the man you did even 2 or 3 years ago." "I am a little run down," Deane said. "I am going to take a holiday in a few weeks." "You are coming to us in Scotland, of course," said Lord Nunneley. "But holiday or no holiday, take my advice. Even if you have to sacrifice a bit, don't stay in harness too long. The money you can't spend isn't worth a snap of the fingers. You and Olive could live on the interest of what you have, and there's scarcely a thing you need deny yourselves." Deane hesitated for a moment. "That is true enough," he said, "but it is never quite so easy, when one is involved in things as I am, to escape from them. The devil's spider spins a golden web to catch us mortals, and it's hard work to get out of it. I'm afraid that my shareholders would consider themselves very much aggrieved if I sent in my resignation without at least a year's warning." "A year?" Lord Nunneley remarked reflectively. "Well, I should feel quite satisfied if I thought that you were going to chuck it then. Don't misunderstand me, Deane," he went on. "Please don't for a moment believe that I am such an arrant snob as to mind having a son-in-law who's engaged in business. I look upon yours as a jolly fine position, and I can assure you that I have a sincere respect for a man who has attained to it at your age. It is simply that I fancy you are carrying a much heavier burden than you sometimes realize, simply for your own sake and Olive's, that I would like to hear of you taking things more easily." "I understand," Deane said. "I quite understand. You are really very kind, Lord Nunneley. Even if it is impossible for me to escape just the moment, I can assure you that I shall take the first opportunity of doing so." The butler, with an apologetic bow, came softly across the room and delivered a message. Lady Olive was going to a party, and would be glad if Mr. Deane could come into the drawing room at once. Section 4 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 4, A Murder. Deane, with the air of one who was a habitué to the house, found his way to the drawing room, where Lady Olive was seated before the piano, playing softly. She rose as he entered, and came to meet him. "I have barely a quarter of an hour, Stirling," she said. "It was too absurd of you to be sitting there talking to father all the time. Come and say nice things to me. Mother has gone upstairs to put on her tiara." He held her at arm's length for a moment, looking at her. She was not very tall, but she was graceful, and she carried herself as the women of her family had done since the days of Elizabeth. Her face was a little cold, except when she smiled, and her eyes were large and brilliant. There was about her toilet and her features a sort of trim perfection, which left no room for criticism. She was considered, amongst those whom she called her friends, handsome rather than beautiful, and ambitious rather than affectionate. Nevertheless, she blushed most becomingly when Deane stooped to kiss her, and her face certainly seemed to lose for the time its somewhat cold expression. "You are going to the Waldrons, I suppose," he remarked. "You look charming, dear." She made a little grimace. "It's too bad that you won't be there. However, in a few days that will be all right. Now that our engagement is announced, everyone will send you cards, of course, for everywhere I go." He smiled a little doubtfully. "You won't expect too much of me in that way, will you?" he asked. "My afternoons, for instance, are nearly always occupied." "You will not find me exacting," she said, with a reassuring nod. "I don't expect you to play the part of social butterfly at all. And although we must be seen together sometimes, of course, I haven't the least desire to keep you dangling at my heels. Tell me, what has father been talking to you about?" "He has been urging me to leave the city," Deane said, "and buy an estate." Lady Olive looked thoughtful. "That is very interesting," she said. "What have you to say about it?" he asked. "It depends," she answered, "very much upon circumstances. I am not sure that I approve of a man having nothing whatever to do. Besides, I have no idea how rich you are, Stirling. I think I ought to warn you that I am very extravagant." "I am delighted to hear it," he assured her. "I should dislike a wife who wouldn't spend my money." They were sitting side by side upon a sofa, and she toyed with her fan for several moments. Then she held out her right hand to him and allowed it to remain in his grasp. For Lady Olive this was distinctly a lover like proceeding. She was not at all sure in her own mind whether such a liberty was judicious, having been brought up always to consider any display of affection as utterly bourgeois. "It seems a curious question to ask," she said thoughtfully, "but after all it would be only affectation to pretend that I was not interested. Tell me what your income is about, Stirling." "In round figures," he answered, "it is today, I should think, a trifle over 25,000 a year." She nodded approvingly, and yet without a great deal of enthusiasm. "We ought to be able to make that do," she said. "Do you mean that it would be as much as that if you gave up business? Perhaps you could give it up partially and keep a few directorships or something of that sort." "I could not give up my work at all," he told her, "for 2 years. I get a very large income from my company, and I have an agreement with them. Besides, my own interests are so woven up with theirs that I could not run the risk of having anyone at the head of affairs in whom I had not complete confidence." She nodded. "That is quite reasonable," she admitted. "You get holidays, of course?" "Naturally," he answered. There was a short silence. Lady Olive was half inclined to wonder why, having possessed himself of her hand, he made none of the other overtures which she had always understood were usual. Deane, however, was in no humor for love making. She had represented to him only a few days ago a part of his future life which was altogether inevitable, and which he could easily come to find pleasant enough. But just now there seemed to be a barrier between them. Notwithstanding Lord Nunneley's kindness and his wife's approval, he knew very well that it was not only Stirling Deane who had been accepted as a suitor. It was the millionaire, the man of great affairs, the man of untarnished reputation. Dick Sinclair's threats were still ringing in his ears. He somehow felt that he was not even playing the game to be sitting there, holding the hand of this most exclusive young lady. "You are a little quiet tonight," she remarked. "Perhaps," he answered smilingly, "I am a little shy." She was inclined to take his words seriously. There had been moments before their engagement when he had certainly looked at her in a very different manner, when she had realized that if she really did say yes to him, she might find herself in danger of having to submit to something a little more vigorous than the ordinary love making she knew anything of. She had even made up her mind, with a faint blush, to submit to it, had grown to expect it. Somehow, although she would have found the admission distinctly humiliating, she was a trifle disappointed. "I wonder," she whispered, looking down upon the carpet, if you really need encouragement." She felt a sudden thrill as his arm touched her, a sudden sense of his enveloping presence. Then the door opened, and she withdrew herself quickly. The Countess came into the room, a curious replica of her daughter, except that her hair was gray and the light in her eyes a little steelier. "So sorry you're not going with us," she remarked to Deane. "Inquire if the brougham is waiting," she continued, turning to her maid. "No, don't bother, Stirling," she added, as he moved toward the door. "We are really in plenty of time." Lord Nunneley came in with the evening paper in his hand. "Is there any news, George?" his wife asked. He shook his head. "There never is," he answered. "The evening papers aren't worth looking at now. Shocking murder, by the by, at one of the big hotels." Deane turned slowly around. "A murder?" he repeated. His host nodded as he lit a cigarette. "Fellow just arrived in the country," he remarked. "Supposed to have had a lot of money in his pocket. Found dead in his room about 7 o'clock tonight." "Do you remember the name of the hotel?" asked Deane. Lord Nunneley glanced at the paper which he still held in his hand. "The Universal," he answered. "That huge new place, you know, near the Strand." "Was the murderer caught?" Deane asked. "Arrested just as he was leaving the hotel," Lord Nunneley answered. "At least they arrested the man they thought had done it. Here's the paper if you have a taste for horrors." Deane stood perfectly still for several minutes. Lady Olive was buttoning her gloves and did not notice him. Her mother was standing at the farther end of the room, helping herself to coffee. Lord Nunneley, alone, was conscious of the change in his guest's expression. "Nothing wrong, I hope, Deane?" he asked. "You didn't know the fellow by any chance, did you?" Deane shook his head. He spoke very quietly and very distinctly. Except that he was unusually pale, his manner showed no signs of emotion. And yet, all the time he felt he was being stifled. In his ears was the singing of tragedy. "No," he said, "I never heard of him in my life." He crossed the room to help Lady Olive with her cloak. "Stay and have a smoke with me," Lord Nunneley suggested. "I am going round to the club in about an hour's time, and then I am going to pick these people up at a ball somewhere." "You are very kind," Deane answered. "To tell you the truth, I have just remembered a very important letter which I ought to have written. If you will excuse me, I am going to hurry away at once. I should like to catch my secretary before he leaves." Lord Nunneley nodded. "You'll have to get him to give it up," he said to his daughter. "Fancy having to write a business letter at 10 o'clock at night. Perfect slavery." "Shall I see you tomorrow, Stirling?" Lady Olive asked, walking with him into the hall. "We'll lunch if you like," he said, "or shall I come to tea? I shall not be busy much afternoon." "I am not quite sure what I have to do tomorrow," she answered, "but I think that I would rather that you came here. We'll meet sometime, anyhow. Good bye." He raised her fingers to his lips. "Enjoy yourself," he said. She shrugged her shoulders. "Absolutely a duty dance," she murmured, waving her hand. "I know that I shall be bored to death. By the by, Stirling, don't forget that in about 3 weeks' time I want you to give a luncheon party at the Carlton to Julie and her husband and some of the others." "As soon as you like," Deane answered. "Julie won't be back till then," Lady Olive said. "Au revoir." Section 5 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 5. A Debt Incurred. A little stream of people came suddenly out from the dark, forbidding-looking building into the sunlit street. The tragedy was over, and one by one they took their several ways and were swallowed up in the restless life of the great city. Yet there was not one of them who did not carry in his face some trace of those hours of gloomy excitement, some reminiscent shadow of the tragedy which had spread itself out into passionate life before their eyes. The most callous was conscious of a few minutes' unusual gravity. Some of the more impressionable carried with them the memory of that hot, crowded room, the air of tense excitement, the slowly spoken solemn words throughout that day and many days to come. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul. There was one man who issued from the building and made his way into the street who seemed altogether dazed. His lips were drawn tightly together. His eyes were set in an unseeing stare. It was not until he had walked 50 yards or so that he seemed even to realize where he was. Then he came to a sudden standstill and retraced his steps. Standing outside the building which he had just quitted was a small electric brougham, in front of which he stopped. He glanced at his watch. It was a few minutes past 1 o'clock. All around was the great stream of city men and clerks hurrying to their midday meal. Once more he stood with the handle in his hand. He looked back down the dark passage guarded by a single policeman, through which he had come a moment or two before. The scene in the little courthouse spread itself out with almost hideous precision before his reluctant eyes. He saw once more what is certainly the greatest tragedy which the mechanical side of our everyday life can offer to the seeker after sensations. He saw a man stand up and listen to the words pronounced which are to deprive him of life. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul. Deane turned to his chauffeur. "The Carlton," he said, and stepped inside. The brougham glided away, swung in and out of the traffic, and ran smoothly along the embankment westward. Deane let down both the windows, took off his hat, and placed it on the seat opposite him. Then he drew a small, fine cambric handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his forehead. "God in heaven!" he muttered to himself. 12 men, and not one of them could see the truth. 12 men, all fools. He took a cigarette from a small gold case and lit it with trembling fingers. Then he leaned out of the carriage window. "Stop at the Metropole, Richards," he ordered. The man was just swinging into Northumberland Avenue, and he pulled up in front of the hotel. Deane went in hurriedly and made his way to the smoking room, exchanging abrupt greetings with one or two acquaintances. Then he ordered and drank quickly a large brandy and soda. When he retraced his steps he felt more composed. "To the Carlton now," he ordered. "Hurry, please. I fancy that I am a little late." In the foyer of the restaurant Lady Olive came slowly forward to meet him. She was beautifully dressed, and she wore her clothes with the air of one who has been accustomed to be clad in silk and laces from the days of her cradle. She had been a beauty for so long that no one questioned her looks. It seemed even incredible that she was 29 years old. One realized that she was the order of women who refused to grow old, women without nerves, unruffled by emotions, women who come smiling through the years unconscious devotees of the essential philosophy. To Deane she had never seemed more desirable than when she greeted him with a slight uplifting of her eyebrows, and turned to present him to another man and woman who were standing by. "Mr. Deane is going to make the usual excuses, I know," she declared. "Let us anticipate him, and say nothing about our wait. We won't even ask whether it was a directors' meeting or a message from the governor of the Bank of England. Stirling, this is my cousin, Mary Elstree, and her husband, Major Elstree, Mr. Deane. The others are somewhere about. What a tiresome person Julia is! She has drifted away over there with a lot of people whom I don't know. That is the worst of taking Julia anywhere. I think she would discover acquaintances in an ABC shop. Do find her, Stirling. No, don't bother. Here she comes." A tall, dark woman detached herself from a neighboring crowd and came up to Deane with outstretched hands. "My dear man," she exclaimed, "how dare you look so cool and nonchalant? Do you realize that we are all starving? We have been waiting here for you for more than half an hour." "I'm sorry," answered Deane. "You see, you people have taken to lunching so early nowadays. You make it hard for a man to get through any work at all in the city." "Early lunches have come in with the simpler life," Julia Ratham declared. "One has so many more hours to look forward to dinner, and so much more appetite when it comes. I suppose we must forgive you," she went on. "At any rate, you are better than my husband, who won't come out to lunch at all. He says that all restaurant food is poisonous, and I can't drag him away from the club. Why a man should put his digestion before our society, I can't imagine. I hope you will never be so ungallant, Mr. Deane. Shall we go in, Olive?" "If you will excuse me for one moment," Deane said, passing on ahead, "I will just see that the table is all right. I telephoned to Gustav, but even a maître d'hôtel forgets sometimes." He looked into the room and nodded to the presiding genius who came hurrying up. The table was there, duly reserved and covered with the dark red roses which he had ordered. He turned to Mrs. Elstree and the others who were following her. "I think we can go in," he said. "I hope you people have not lost all your appetites waiting for me." Lady Olive looked at him a little curiously as she took the seat at his left, hers by unspoken consent as his fiancée. "My dear Stirling," she whispered, "have you had a very trying morning? You look somehow as though you had been worried." He hesitated. "Well," he answered, "scarcely that, perhaps. I had rather a bad hour or so. Things don't always go our way, you know, in the city, even when one is most prosperous." "You are foolish to worry," she said calmly. "Half the people in the world spoil their lives by giving way to that sort of thing. I should have thought that your temperament would have saved you from that." Deane smiled. "Remember," he said, "that I have been in other places when I might have been with you, and excuse me." "You are much too gallant," she said with a little laugh, "to argue with seriously." "By the by," Major Elstree asked, "has anyone seen a special edition? I wonder if the Rowan case is finished?" Deane set down the wine glass which he had just raised to his lips. "The verdict was given just as I left the city," he answered. "Rowan was found guilty." Section 6 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 6, An Imperious Demand. There was a little murmur of interest. On the whole, although the result of the trial had seemed fairly certain, everyone was surprised. "Guilty of murder or manslaughter?" Major Elstree asked. "Of murder," answered Deane. "There was not even a recommendation to mercy." Lady Olive looked reproachfully at him. "My dear Stirling, you really shouldn't have told us at lunch time. If I hadn't been so very hungry, I'm sure it would have taken my appetite away. He was such a good-looking fellow, and he has been so brave all through the trial." "Brave or callous, do you think?" Major Elstree asked. "Brave, I think," Julia Raynham declared, leaning forward in her place. "I went to the trial the first day. He followed every question that was asked, and he was always making suggestions to his solicitor. I think when one understands like that, when one's intellect is working all the time, that you cannot call it callousness." "I agree with you," Lady Olive declared. "I was there myself, and except that he looked so ill, he seemed quite indifferent and absolutely free from nervousness. Yet I am quite sure that he realized his position. My dear Stirling, how thoughtful of you to remember the homard américain. I adore hot lobster, don't you, Julia?" "Delicious," Julia murmured. "I wonder," Major Elstree said reflectively, "what must be the state of mind of a man who has gone through a trial lasting 4 or 5 days and suddenly realizes that it is over and finished, and that he has lost. This poor fellow, for instance, when he woke up this morning, he perhaps hoped to be free tonight. Things went altogether his way yesterday, and instead of being free, he has been taken back to his cell and knows, even at this minute, he is realizing that he will never leave it again until he leaves it to die. Personally," he continued, "I think that the period of time between pronouncement of a sentence and its execution ought to be swept away. I cannot imagine anything more horrible, especially to a man who has to spend the long nights alone, with that one thought racking his brain." Lady Olive laid down her fork. "My dear Harry," she declared, "do be a little bit more considerate. How are we to enjoy our luncheon if we think of that poor man?" Major Elstree bowed across the table. "I forgot," he said. "Let us enjoy our luncheon by all means. At the same time, I am going to drink my first glass of wine to a reprieve. We won't discuss the question of whether he deserves it or not. We will talk instead, if you like, of Directory gowns and Flying Star's chance for the Gold Cup. But I drink my toast." "You are very quiet, Stirling," Lady Olive murmured to the man who sat by her side. Deane smiled at her. "I am afraid that sometimes when I come away from a maze of figures, my brain, or at any rate my tongue, is not so nimble as it should be. I'll keep pace with you all presently." A frock-coated, white-waistcoated maître d'hôtel came smiling up and addressed him confidentially. "Mr. Deane," he said, "you are wanted for a moment upon the telephone." "You are sure that it is I who am wanted?" Deane asked, a little doubtfully. "Quite sure, sir," the man replied. "The inquiry was for Mr. Stirling Deane." Deane rose to his feet. "You will excuse me," he begged, turning to his guests. "I suppose they have found out at the office that I am here, and they have probably something to say to me." Nevertheless, as he left the room and crossed the hall, Deane was conscious of feeling more than a little puzzled. He was quite certain that he had not told a soul at the office of the Incorporated Gold Mines Association, over which he presided, that he was lunching at the Carlton. He was equally certain that he had not told anyone else. He took up the receiver of the instrument with some curiosity. "Who is it?" he asked. "Who are you?" was the reply. "I am Stirling Deane," Deane said. "Who are you? And what do you want with me? Is it the office?" "No," was the reply, in a voice wholly unfamiliar to him. "It is not the office, Mr. Deane. It is someone with news for you." "News?" Deane repeated. "I should like to know who you are first, and to hear your news afterwards." "Who I am is of no consequence," was the reply. "My news is that Basil Rowan has been found guilty and has been sentenced to be hanged. The verdict has just been pronounced." The receiver nearly fell from Deane's fingers. He restrained himself, however, with an effort. "Well," he said, "what is that to you or to me?" "That is a matter which we will not discuss over the telephone," was the calm reply. "I rang you up to tell you this because I thought it was well that you should know quickly. I ask you now, what are you going to do?" Deane's was the face of a strong man, a man who scarcely knew the meaning of the word nerves. Yet he felt himself struggling with a sudden sense of being stifled. Something seemed to be hammering at his brain. His breath was coming in little sobs. He answered this mysterious voice almost incoherently. "What do you mean? How can it concern me? Tell me who you are at once," he said. "It does not matter who I am," was the reply. "You have no time to think about that. What you want to realize is that Basil Rowan has been found guilty and that he will be hanged within a fortnight unless—" "Unless what?" Deane gasped. "Unless someone intervenes," was the quiet answer. "Who could intervene?" he demanded hoarsely. "How can anyone intervene?" "You know," was the quiet answer. Deane staggered out of the telephone box with those last words ringing in his ears. He felt dazed, scarcely master of himself. The healthy color seemed to have been drawn from his cheeks as he turned mechanically back toward the restaurant. Halfway there, however, he paused. For the moment he felt it impossible to face his guests. He turned into the little smoking room and sat down. The place was empty. Even the little bar was deserted. He sat in one of the green leather chairs, his hands clutching the cushioned arms, his eyes fixed steadily upon the wall. Slowly it seemed to fall away, to crumble into nothingness before his rigid gaze. Again He saw the somber-looking courthouse, the judge upon the bench, his sphinx-like face set in an attitude of cold attention. He saw the barristers with their wigs and gowns, the few distinguished strangers upon the bench, the crowd of sightseers behind the barriers. And in the center of it all, Basil Rowan, his pale face and drawn features standing out vividly against the gloomy background. It was no ordinary trial this. The subtle, dramatic excitement, with only a question of life or death seemed to generate, was throbbing through the dreary court. It was only, comparatively speaking, a few days ago that the man who stood there now waiting to hear his doom had found his way down into the city, and sat in his office and made his passionate appeal. Deane's hands gripped the sides of the chair, and his lips moved. He told himself, as he had told himself 100 times before, that this act was none of his doing, that not a single word of his had suggested or approved of it. He had spoken of arguments of influence. Was it any responsibility of his that the man who had listened had gone further, had chosen to gamble instead with life and death? Deane went back through that conversation word by word. No, he was guiltless. He had not suggested violence. He even told himself that he would not have approved of it. And yet the weight upon his heart was not lightened. The little picture was still there, reproduced with almost photographic exactness. Was it his fancy, or had the trembling man's eyes really turned towards him? Had his white lips really framed that passionate, unspoken appeal which seemed to ring in his ears? Deane rose to his feet with a little stifled cry. He seemed to understand now how men who were left alone with their thoughts might find madness. End of section 6. Section 7 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 7. Love or Interest. Deane found his little party drinking their coffee in the Palm Lounge. Lady Olive greeted him with upraised eyebrows. "My dear Stirling," she exclaimed, "have you been telephoning to the other end of the world?" "I'm so sorry," he answered, taking the vacant chair by her side. "I came away from the office feeling that I had forgotten something, and it took me quite a long time to straighten things out. Tell me, what are you all going to do this afternoon?" "We're going down to Ranelagh," said Lady Olive. "There is some tennis, and Dicky is playing polo in the regimental finals. Don't you think that you could take an hour off or so and come down with us? You really look as though you needed some fresh air." Deane shook his head. "Nothing in the world," he declared, "is more impossible. I have an appointment in the city at 3:30, and another at 4. After that, I have at least 100 letters to dictate." "I am beginning to discover," Lady Olive remarked, with an air of resignation, "that there are disadvantages in being engaged to a city man." Deane smiled. "Let us hope," said he, "that after you are married you will still regard the situation in the same light. Your friend Julia, for instance, declares that she would never have married anyone who was not kept away from home at regular intervals." Lady Olive leaned a little toward him. After all, he had been very nice. The Elstrees had found him delightful, and there was no man in the lounge so half good-looking. She decided to say something charming. "Julia," she whispered, "was never in love with her husband, even before she married him." "And you?" Deane murmured. She laughed at him and looked away, but he was suddenly insistent, taking her hand and forcing her to turn again toward him. "Tell me," he said quietly, "do you really care for me, Olive? Oh, I know you care enough to justify you in marrying me, but I mean something different. I mean, do you really care in the great fashion, you know, like the people one reads of, Ilsut and Amy Robsart and those?" She looked at him as though he were speaking some foreign language. The earnestness in his face was unmistakable. She answered him with a perplexed little frown upon her forehead. "Ah, I wonder," she murmured. "What a very strange question to ask me, Stirling, just now. Frankly, I don't know. I can only tell you that there is no other man. You are quite alone." The others were all discussing some subject of kindred interest. Deane felt curiously prompted to continue his questioning. His engagement had been such a very matter of fact affair. To a certain extent it was understood that he was marrying for position, and she for wealth, and yet in all their conversations they had discreetly concealed the fact. They had told each other that they cared, if not with passion, at least in the most approved manner. There had been no suggestion in their many tete-a-tetes that they were about to embark upon a marriage of convenience. "Tell me," Deane persisted, "if things should go wrong with me, or if you had met me simply as a struggler with my feet upon the early rungs of the ladder, tell me, could you have cared for me then, do you think?" She looked at him curiously. There was something in his face which compelled the truth. "I do not know," she said. "Let me think." "Think by all means," he continued. "Remember that I was introduced to you, even as one of the youngest millionaires. Forgive me if I seem egotistical, but I have a fancy to put things plainly. There is a glamour about wealth. I came to you with that glamour about my name. I am rich, of course, and wealth means power. How much of your affection, Olive, came out to the man, and how much to the millionaire?" "You want me to give you a perfectly honest answer?" she asked. "Absolutely," he assured her. "Don't be afraid of hurting my vanity. I want nothing but the truth." "At first, then," she told him, "nothing to the man and everything to the millionaire. This afternoon," she continued, "I rather fancy that the man has the larger share. You are quite a fascinating person, Stirling, when you choose to make yourself agreeable." "You can't accuse me," he remarked, "of making any special efforts in that direction to day." "No," she answered. "You are rather quiet, but still you are yourself. Personally, I am beginning to find something very attractive about a silent man. You speak quite often enough, and what you say is to the point. It seems always to be the pronouncement of the man who knows. You have what Julia calls an air of reserved strength about you, which I fancy that my sex finds a little attractive. Tell me, why all this questioning?" Deane looked away, through the cluster of palms into the little smoking room from which he had issued a few minutes before. "Even the houses," he said, "which according to the injunctions of the Scripture are built upon a rock, are liable to destruction by earthquakes. So even the strongest of us in the city have always the 100th chance of working in the world against us. The most amazing collapses have taken place. I was really wondering what would happen, how greatly it would affect you, if my riches were to vanish into thin air." "What an unpractical person you are this afternoon," she murmured, looking at him curiously. "Suppose I were to sit here and worry about the fit of the dress which Madame Oliver is sending me home this afternoon for the ball to night. I could make myself miserable in 5 minutes without the shadow of a reason." "Madame Oliver," he declared, "would deserve bankruptcy if she failed to fit a figure like yours." Lady Olive laughed. "Really," she said, "you are becoming quite a courtier." "Dear people," Julia Ram murmured, leaning over, "if we may bring you back to the mundane world, everybody else is dying to start for Ranelagh." Lady Olive made a little grimace, and rose to her feet at once. "Stirling and I have only been boring one another because you all seem so occupied," she declared. "Ranelagh, by all means. It's quite time we made a move." They made their way toward the Pall Mall entrance of the restaurant. Lady Olive fell back once more with Deane. "It's such a nuisance about this wretched dinner tonight," she said. "I think it was very bad taste indeed of the Duchess to ask us without you. You won't forget to come in and see me for half an hour before we go to the ball? I shall be in my room at 11 o'clock punctually, and I will arrange so that I can take you on to Amberley House." He bowed. "I shall be with you." "Where are you dining?" she asked. "At the club, most likely. I never dine out on Wednesdays if I can help it. We are always so busy. I shall have a quiet, comfortable evening." "Au revoir, then," she said, stepping into one of the 2 automobiles which were waiting. Deane made his adieux to the rest of the party and watched them drive off. Then he called a hansom. Messrs. Hardaway and Sons, Bedford Row, he told the man. Drive as quickly as you can. End of section 7. Section 8 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 8. An Awful Responsibility. John Hardaway, although he was a solicitor in a very busy practice, did not keep his friend waiting for a moment. "Come in, Deane, old chap," he said. "Is this business or friendship?" "Mostly business," declared Deane. Hardaway glanced at the clock. 12 minutes precisely, he said. "Fire away, there's a good fellow. You are not going to give me the affairs of the Incorporated Gold Mines Association to look after, I suppose?" "Not I," Deane answered. "They need a more subtle brain than yours. I'm afraid I have come to see you about the other affair." The lawyer nodded. "You heard the result?" he asked. "We did what we could." "Perhaps," Deane answered. "The only thing is that you did not do enough. I'm perfectly convinced, Hardaway, that the man did not go there with the intention of murdering Sinclair." "The evidence," Hardaway remarked, "was exceedingly awkward." "Do you think," Deane asked, "that there is any chance of a reprieve?" "As things stand at present," said Hardaway, "I'm afraid not." Deane, for the first time, sat down. With frowning face he seemed to be engaged in a deliberate study of the pattern of the carpet. "Hardaway," he said finally, "I want to ask you a question in criminal law." The lawyer laughed dryly. "Not on your own account, I hope?" "You can call it curiosity or whatever you like," Deane answered. "The only point is that I want you to answer me a question and forget that I have ever asked it you. Your lawyer is like your confessor, isn't he? Your lawyer and your doctor?" "He should be," Hardaway answered gravely. "Then here goes," Deane said. "I put a case to you. I mention no names. You can imagine, if you like, that I am writing a novel. A man is tried for murder, and he is sentenced to be hanged. All the time there has been watching this case, listening to every word of the evidence, a person who knows quite as much of it as the prisoner himself. Someone who, if it had been possible, could have gone into the witness box and could very likely have induced the jury to have reduced the charge from murder to manslaughter. Never mind the reasons which made the man hold his tongue. Consider only the fact that he did hold his peace, believing in his heart that it was not possible on the evidence which was submitted for the man to be sentenced. As it happened, the case for the prosecution was worked up with almost diabolical cleverness, and the prisoner was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to be hanged. What can this person do to save his life? The trial is closed. It is too late for him to offer himself as a witness." Hardaway nodded. "I understand," he said. "The procedure is very simple. He should go to the solicitors for the defense, and they will communicate with the Home Secretary." "The case cannot be reopened?" Deane asked. "No," answered Hardaway, with a shake of the head. "Our criminal law has many anomalies. The only thing that could happen in the prisoner's favor would be that if this favorable evidence were convincing enough, the prisoner might be granted a free pardon, and the facts made known through the press. Anything more I can tell you?" "Nothing," Deane answered, rising. "Many thanks, old fellow. You have told me just what I want to know." 6 and 8 pence, please," Hardaway remarked, holding out his hand. Deane laughed and shook his head. "I shan't pay," he declared. "You can run it in with the other account, or I'll stand you a dinner when and where you please. A dinner and a box at the Alhambra, if you like." Hardaway smiled. "We can't run our office on such clients as you," he remarked, pressing the bell. "You should never try to fleece your friends," Deane said. "Referring for one moment to the other affair," began Hardaway. "Well?" "The only real chance of a reprieve that I can see," Hardaway continued, "is on account of the fellow's health. I believe he is really very much worse than he appears, and I fancy that if we had a medical examination it would give us at least a chance. The trouble is that he really seems quite indifferent. Are you thinking of trying to see him, Deane?" Deane shook his head. "No," he said, "I'm afraid I must not do that. There are reasons why I dare not let my name be associated in any way with this affair. They may come out later on, but just at present I would rather not tell even you what they are. By the by, has anyone representing the dead man turned up at all? I mean, has anyone claimed his effects?" "No one," the lawyer answered. "From what I can learn, they are very insignificant." Deane nodded. "Can I rely upon you," he asked, "to let me know at once if anyone should come forward to claim them?" "By all means," Hardaway answered. Deane went out into the street and stood there for a few moments a little aimlessly. Then he called a cab and was driven to his offices, a great block of buildings like a bank, situated in a small court off Throgmorton Street. He passed through the outer offices slowly, asking several questions and shaking hands with one or two acquaintances. When at last he reached the inner room, his own sanctum, he turned out his secretary ruthlessly and locked the door. He sat in his leather chair in front of the open table, covered with letters and books of reference. It was before this table that he had built up the fortunes of the great corporation at whose head he was. He sat there now, erect in his chair, with his hands outstretched on the table before him, his eyes looking through the frosted panes of glass opposite. Was there any compromise, he asked himself, any possible compromise? Again he was looking into the gloomy court. Again he saw the white face of the man who so short time ago had sat in this very room, only a few feet away, and had begged so hard for his chance. The whole scene came flashing back to Deane as he sat there. How much blame, after all, was his? He had not suggested violence. He refused to admit that it had entered into his head. Yet he had known what manner of men these two were. He had known, and their meeting had been all his making. Never in this world would he be able to escape from the responsibility of it. Never in this world would he be able to hear those awful words without a sense of real and personal guilt. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul. End of section 8. Section 9 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 9, Winifred Rowan. The clerk who brought in the little slip of paper was both timid and apologetic. He felt himself between two fires. The young lady outside had been a little more than insistent. The man in whose presence he had come was one who never forgave a mistake. "You will pardon me, sir," he said. "I hope I have not done wrong. The young lady outside positively declined to go away until she had seen you. I thought that I had better at least bring you in her name. I remembered that a few weeks ago you saw a gentleman of the same name, although it was one of your busiest mornings." Deane held out his hand, frowning. "A young lady," he remarked, shortly. "Well?" He took the little slip of paper into his hands and read, "Winifred Rowan." He looked up into the clerk's impassive face and back again at the slip of paper. "The young lady is waiting outside?" he asked. "She is outside, sir," the clerk answered. "I explained to her that you were not in the habit of seeing any callers except by appointment, and I begged her to write and fix a time, if she really had business with you. She declared, however, that the matter was an urgent one. Mr. Sawday and I both heard what she had to say, sir, and we thought it best that I should bring you in her name." Deane nodded slowly. "I dare say you are right, Gray," he said. "Since the young lady is so persistent, you had better show her in. See that I am not disturbed again this afternoon, however. I have a good deal to do." The clerk departed with a great weight off his mind. It was obvious that he had done the right thing. He left the door ajar, and Deane sat with his hands clenching the sides of his luxuriously padded writing chair. Winifred Rowan. It was a relative, then, most likely the sister of whom he had spoken. What was he to say or do? How much was he to admit? Perhaps she had brought him a message. Perhaps she could tell him one thing which he was on fire to know. Winifred Rowan. Half unconsciously he uttered the name aloud. What sort of a woman would she be, or girl, or child? He had no knowledge of Rowan save as a fellow adventurer, seeker after fortune in a strange land. A brave man, willing always to take his life into his hands if the goal were worthy. Perhaps it might be that she had been with him. Perhaps she was bringing a message. He heard the murmur of voices outside. The door was pushed open. The clerk stood on one side. "This is the young lady, sir," he announced. "Miss Winifred Rowan." Deane rose for a moment to his feet. The clerk, with a little deferential movement, closed the door and departed. They were alone in the room together. Deane, whose self-control was one of the personal characteristics which had counted for something in his rapid access to prosperity, felt a nerveless exclamation break from his lips. The girl who came slowly into the room seemed so perfectly to represent what Rowan himself might have become. She was an idealized likeness of the man by whose side he had fought and suffered and rejoiced, the man who only a few weeks ago had stood in her place and made his desperate appeal. An idealized likeness, perhaps, in more ways than one. She was younger, and the stress of life had only lately set its mark upon her. She was fair as he was fair, with gray blue eyes, brown hair, and quivering lips, a figure slim and yet pliant, a manner, even in silence, appealing, enticing. Deane felt himself curiously moved at the sight of her. Then he remembered suddenly how great was his need of self-control. She was the sister of this man who lay under sentence of death. Perhaps she had come to plead for his help. He must be careful. All the time he must be careful. "You wish to see me?" he asked, a little brusquely. "I am Stirling Deane. Will you take a chair and tell me in as few words as you can what you want?" She ignored his gesture of invitation. She came on until she had reached the table before which he was seated. Then she leaned across, and the light of her eyes, the very insistence of her presence, seemed like things from which no escape was possible. "Mr. Deane," she said, "I am Basil Rowan's sister. I have come from the Old Bailey prison. I have come," she added, with faltering voice and a sudden new terror in her face, "from the condemned cell." Deane had a reserved stock of courage to draw upon, and he drew upon it freely. He looked at her with upraised eyebrows. "You have come to me?" he repeated. "Why?" "First of all, then," she answered, "I will tell you why." "I think," he interrupted, "that you had better take a seat." She seemed, indeed, in the need of some support. She sank into the chair which he had indicated. It was close to his side, and yet placed so that the light which fell upon her face left him in the shadow. "You have come from your brother," he said. "Do I understand that he sent you, that he knew you were coming to me?" "Yes," she answered. "He told me to be very careful, to be sure that no one else knew, and never to mention your name. But I have come at his bidding." "Very well," Deane said. "I shall be glad to hear your message." "He gave me no explanation," she said. "He allowed me to ask for none. He told me to come to you and say this." "There is no one," she asked in a lower tone, looking nervously around, "who could possibly overhear us?" "Not a soul." "He told me to say," she continued, leaning forward, with her eyes suddenly a little distended, "that he had no difficulty in finding the man of whom you two had spoken, the man whom you used to call Bully Sinclair. He spent the evening with him, drank with him, went back to his hotel by invitation. Then he tried very carefully to open up negotiations. Sinclair became at once suspicious. He was very violent and declined to discuss the matter at all. He swore all the time that he had been robbed and that he was going to have his revenge. My brother tried to reason with him, and in the end they quarreled. It was Sinclair who struck Basil. My brother only returned the blow. And then he told me to say that before he could search him, before he could search the room, he found that the man was dead." "Anything else?" Deane asked. "He told me to say that any papers which the man Sinclair might have had must be in the room among his effects, which have all been put together and are still there, locked up, waiting for someone to come and claim them. He told me to say that he has done his best, and that whatever the consequences might be, he was ready to face him. If you cared to run risks, the number of the room at the Universal Hotel is 27. It is locked and guarded, but there might be ways. That is what he said." Deane leaned a little forward across the table. "But of himself?" he demanded. "Did he say nothing of himself?" She shook her head. "It is wonderful," she said, "but he never thinks of himself. He is more composed, more cheerful than when I bade him good night at Southampton, the day he left home. He made me promise that I would tell you these things first before I uttered a word on my own account. I have kept my promise. You understand what I have told you?" "Perfectly," Deane answered. "Then I am going to speak to you now on my own account," she said, raising her eyes to his. "Mr. Deane, I do not pretend to be a clever person, but one thing is perfectly clear to me. Basil entered into this adventure for your sake. Your name was never mentioned in the trial, and they all seem to have believed that it was to rob Sinclair and for nothing else that Basil went there that night. Mr. Deane, I don't believe it. His quarrel with Sinclair and its awful termination was an accident. You must come forward and say that he went there to serve you and not for the purpose of robbery. It is for you to save his life. You can do it, and he is my only brother." Deane's eyebrows came a little closer together. The girl who looked at him wondered no more at the hopeless way in which her brother had spoken of this man. His face was as though it were carved out of a stone. "Miss Rowan," he said, "if there is anything which I can do for your brother, I will do it, for the sake of the days when we lived together, and when we were so near the very heart of life and death. But I tell you frankly that I see very little chance of successful intervention on my part. It takes a good deal in this country to stay the arm of the law, and your brother has grievously offended against it." She struck the table before which he sat with the palm of her hand. "If he did," she cried, "it was for your sake. I am sure of it. He went to do your bidding, and you must save him." "May I ask," said Deane, "why you are so sure that he went to do my bidding?" "Yes, ask it if you will, and I will answer you. I know it, because this was the real point of all his message to you. This is what I had to say. This is really why I have come. The document, mind. He said no more, but he told me to make this very clear to you. The document is in a worn leather case sewn inside the breast pocket of the coat Sinclair was wearing when he died." Deane drew a little breath. "Young lady," he said, "it seems to me that you have been unnecessarily prolix. Your brother sent you here to tell me this?" "Yes." "He did not send you here," Deane continued, "to beg for help, to waste my time in purposeless recriminations?" "No," she answered faintly. "He knew very well," Deane continued, "that no mortal man can help him. The trial is over and the case is lost. The only thing to work for now is a reprieve." "But that is not what I want," she interrupted. "He must be pardoned." "That," answered Deane, "is impossible. Neither I nor anyone breathing can work miracles." She leaned towards him with an accusing eye. "But it was you," she declared. "It was you for whom he undertook this enterprise." Deane shrugged his shoulders. "My dear young lady," he said, "you are mistaken. I cannot explain to you yet the full significance of those various messages which you have brought me from your brother. But believe me, what he did knowing well the risks he undertook, and without any thought or hope of aid from me if he should fail. I will be quite honest with you, if you like. I will tell you the exact truth. Your brother and Sinclair were once friends. Sinclair and I were always enemies. There was a little matter of business open between us, and I thought that your brother might very well arrange it. I had no idea of his quarreling with Sinclair. I did not encourage him to do so in any way." "You sent him there," she persisted doggedly. "I send messengers to every part of the world," Deane answered, "but I do not incite them to enter into murderous quarrels with the people whom they go to see. I will do what I can for your brother, but it must be in my own way." "You will be able at least to save him from Deane held out his hand. "Of course," he answered. "You need not think about that. His health alone would be sufficient to put that out of the question. What I can do for him, I will. I promise you that." The girl rose up and held out her hands a little piteously. "Remember," she begged, "I have no one else to go to. No other hope but in you. If I lose Basil, I shall be alone in the world." The tears were in her eyes. Every line of her face, every feature, seemed to be pleading with him. Deane led her to the door himself. His tone was unusually kind. "I will do my best," he promised once more. End of section 9. Section 10 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 10. At the Theater. The door had barely closed upon his visitor when Deane was back once more in the throes of business, answering questions, giving quotations, receiving offers. The telephone was reconnected and rang out its impatient summons every few seconds. He signed half a dozen drafts, deputed an understudy to receive some of his visitors who were weary of waiting, and dictated several important letters. When once more the pressure had abated and the telephone had ceased to ring, he leaned back in his chair with a little exclamation of relief. The visit of Rowan's sister and her passionate appeal had unnerved him for a moment. He found himself trying to recall her last words, even at the moment when he realized that she was still in the room, sitting at a distant corner. "Miss Rowan!" he exclaimed. "Why, I thought that you had left." "I went as far as the outer office," she said apologetically. "Then I slipped back again. You were so busy that I did not like to interrupt." Deane rose to his feet. He was a little cramped from long sitting. He lowered the blind and turned on the electric light, walking around the room and casually touching the door to see that it was closely shut. Then he came back to his place and leaned over once more toward the girl. "Why have you come back?" he asked. "To ask you a question," she answered. "Well?" "Basil went on your behalf to see this man Sinclair," she said. "He had a commission from you, had he not? And he failed?" "Yes," Deane said, "he failed." "It was to make an offer for some document, was it not?" Deane nodded. "Yes," he said, "it was." "You are doing your best for Basil," she said, her voice trembling a little. "You paid for his defense, I know. You have promised that you will do all that you can, even now. I thought perhaps I might be able to do something in return. Why couldn't I get this paper for you?" He looked at her steadily for several moments. "You could," he answered, "if you had the pluck." "Tell me how?" she asked. "You are his sister," he said. "Presumably you are interested in his defense. The details of the struggle between those two are, of course, important. It makes all the difference between manslaughter and murder if a weight, for instance, be held in one hand or thrown. You know the lawyers who defended him?" "Of course," she answered. "Go on." "If they apply to the proper authorities," he continued, "they can obtain an order to re-examine the apartments in the Universal Hotel in which the struggle took place. No doubt you also could find your way there. Supposing I tell you the truth. Supposing I admit that your brother did take upon himself a desperate enterprise, and that that enterprise was to recover from this man Sinclair, by purchase or guile, any means which suggested themselves to him, the pocketbook of which you have brought me news. Remember, I commit myself to nothing. I make no definite statement. I simply tell you that it may have been so." "It was," she said firmly. "You and I know that. Well?" "You are his sister," Deane said, "and you have exceptional facilities. If you could gain possession of that pocketbook, you would be doing me a service which I should find it hard indeed to repay." She rose to her feet. "Very well," she said. "It shall be done. I promise you that it shall be done." For the first time, when he saw her standing up, and realized how frail a creature she really was, a wave of pity swept away his own predominant sense of self-interest. "But you are not strong enough for such work as this," he declared. "Better let things drift. I can take care of myself." She shook her head. "I have made up my mind," she said. "I am going to make my effort, whatever happens." "You will remember," he said, "that my name must never pass your lips. No, don't look at me like that," he added quickly. "Don't think of me as a coward or an utterly selfish person. I am here for what I represent. Welfare in this concern or business undertaking, call it what you like, it doesn't mean only ruin or wealth for me. There are hundreds of us, hundreds who are dependent upon the reins I hold. It isn't for myself so much that I care. Try and believe that, will you?" She looked into his eyes. "I will," she murmured. "I will believe everything, but you must save Basil." "Whether you bring me the pocketbook or not," he answered, "I shall assuredly do all that a man can do for him." For the rest of the day Stirling Deane was his normal self. He transacted business with his usual acumen. He received his callers and went through the ordinary routine of his position with no indication of any mental disturbance. He had, indeed, little time to spare for thought. At 6:30 he was whirled away westward in his electric brougham, changed his clothes, dined hurriedly in his room, and at 9:15 was in the stalls of the St. James Theatre, sitting between Lady Olive and her mother. The mechanical part of the day's arrangements he had found it easy enough to carry out, but to keep his thoughts engrossed upon his surroundings was a sheer impossibility. He was not even conscious when the curtain went down until he found Lady Olive's eyes fixed curiously upon him. "Stirling," she said, "I don't think I like you when you have been at the office all day. Tell me, what can there be about this money making so engrossing that you carry it about with you after you have finished your work, like a shadow?" He was at once duly apologetic. "My dear Olive," he said, "if I was distrait for a moment, please forgive me. Consider. It is not my occupation alone which is engrossing. Supposing, for an instance, that I were a politician. Don't you think I should be better employed in thinking over an impending crisis than in listening to an exceedingly dull play?" "Perhaps," she admitted, "but crises do not occur in political affairs every day. I might even be vain enough to suggest another and a simpler means of escape from your boredom." "I am very justly rebuked," he admitted, holding her fingers for a moment. "Only you must remember that this is new for me, to have so delightful a means of escape ready by my side. Give me a little time to realize my good fortune." "So long as it doesn't become a habit," she murmured. "I'm sure I am not exacting, but I should hate to feel that you were always so engrossed in your thoughts that you did not even realize whom you were sitting next." He touched her fingers once more, and his pressure was gently returned. Then, as if conscious that she had been a little more than ordinarily complacent, she withdrew her hand, and leaning over began to talk with her mother about some people whom Deane knew nothing of. A man from behind touched him on the shoulder. He looked up quickly and recognized Hardaway. "Come and have a cigarette," the lawyer said. "It is a quarter of an hour's interval, and I should like to have a word with you." Deane excused himself to his companions and joined his friend in the foyer. "Well?" he asked tersely. Hardaway toyed with a cigarette case and glanced quietly around. He was tall and thin, clean shaven, with hard, pronounced features and sunken gray eyes, gray hair parted in the middle, and a single eyeglass suspended around his neck by a narrow black ribbon. He looked exactly what he was, a criminal lawyer. "I wanted to have a word with you, Deane," he said, "about this Rowan case." Deane nodded. "Is there anything fresh?" he asked. "Nothing particular," the lawyer answered. "Come upstairs for a moment." They found a corner of the refreshment room where no one else was within hearing. Deane lit a cigarette with perfectly steady fingers. There was nothing in his face to indicate the fierce anxiety which was consuming him. "With reference to that case," his companion commenced, "the facts were all so simple that there was no need for the prosecution to consider any other motive than the obvious one of attempted robbery. Therefore, no very searching investigation has been made into the dead man's papers. Yesterday afternoon it occurred to me to look them through once more, in case anything had been overlooked. I came across a clumsy sort of document purporting to be the deeds of a gold mine. I should not have taken any particular notice of it but for the title of the mine." "Well?" "It was the Little Anna Gold Mine," Hardaway continued. "These deeds stated that Sinclair himself was the sole owner. "A very extraordinary document," Deane remarked. "I suppose you couldn't manage things so that I could have a look at it?" "It would be quite impossible," the lawyer answered. "Mine was, of course, a privileged inspection, and I am going beyond my duty in mentioning this affair to you. It certainly did seem very singular." "Especially," Deane remarked, with a faint hard smile, "since you are in a position to know that I have paid for the defence of the prisoner." "It is not my business to connect such facts," the lawyer remarked. "Someone will appear upon the scene sooner or later, of course," Deane said, "and claim this man's effects." "Naturally," Hardaway answered, "although, except for this rather remarkable document, they do not seem to have been very valuable." "If you should hear of anyone," said Deane, "I should be glad if you would let me know without a second's delay." "I will do so," the lawyer promised. The bell tinkled. The men at the bar finished their drinks, threw away their cigarettes, and hurried off. Deane and his companion rose to their feet. "Hardaway," Deane said, "some of the papers are talking about a reprieve for this man Rowan. Will it come to anything, do you think?" "I do not know," the lawyer answered cautiously. They moved along the passage leading down to the stalls. Deane held his companion back until the little throng of hurrying men had passed by. "Listen, Hardaway," he said. "I speak to you as one speaks to the dead, because you know the secrets of your profession, and because I trust you. Is there any way in which a man of great wealth, who had the command of money, say up to £50,000, is there any way in which such a man could help towards obtaining a reprieve?" Hardaway hesitated for a moment. "Of course," he admitted, "influence is always a useful thing. Those who have the ruling of these matters are sometimes hesitating between two minds. A very straw might turn the balance." Deane nodded his head. He looked for a moment behind. His hand rested upon the curtain which led into the stalls. There was not a soul in sight. The play had recommenced. "Hardaway," he said, "I will give £50,000, if necessary, to have that man reprieved. The verdict should have been one of manslaughter. I am convinced of that. I was in court. I heard the sentence. I saw Rowan's face. I saw the judge put on the black cap, and I heard those hateful words. Up to £50,000, mind, Hardaway, and I shan't have your bill of costs taxed." Lady Olive was almost petulant. "What a time you have been, Stirling," she said. "Do forgive me," he begged. "I met a man outside who kept me gossiping about trifles. Tell me, do you think that we can persuade your mother to come out to supper?" "We've nowhere else to go," Lady Olive answered. "Do see if you can talk her into it. It would be very pleasant." "I'll try," he promised. End of section 10. Section 11 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 11, An Appeal. A morning paper, apparently in lack of a new sensation, suddenly took up the cause of Basil Rowan. An evening paper, conducted under the same auspices, promptly followed suit. This was a case, they both declared, of obvious manslaughter. The evidence clearly pointed to a quarrel between the two men. A prominent criminal lawyer allowed his name to be associated with what rapidly grew to be an agitation. Petitions began to appear. The Home Secretary was bombarded with documents. Everywhere people were saying that the man should never have been put on his trial for murder. The jury had been confused by their instructions. It was a case of manslaughter, pure and simple. 3 days after her first visit, Winifred Rowan sat once more in Deane's office. There were lines under her eyes. She seemed to have become thinner and more fragile. Deane himself, save that he was a trifle paler, was unchanged, carefully dressed as usual, and with unruffled demeanor. He sat in his accustomed place and guided the destinies of those great affairs which lay under his control. For the moment he had relaxed. He was doing his best to console the girl who had come to him in a sudden whirl of terror. "My dear Miss Rowan," he said, "I have certain intelligence from my friends. I have gone to great lengths in this matter, and I can assure you that there is not the slightest doubt about a reprieve being forthcoming." She glanced at the calendar. "But think," she said, "already for 3 days he has lain there, sentenced to death. Think of what he must be suffering. Oh, it is horrible! It isn't only death," she cried. "Think of the manner of it, the hideous disgrace, the cruel, cold ugliness of it. Oh, if it should come!" He held out his hand. She was on the verge of hysteria. "It shall not come," he declared firmly. "I have promised you that." "If they are going to reprieve him," she continued, "why do they let him suffer these agonies? Why do they not tell him so at once? I saw him this morning. He says nothing. He is as brave as a man can be, but his eyes are awful, and when he tries to speak his voice dies away. Oh, Mr. Deane, do something! Oh, do something!" She laid her hands suddenly upon his shoulder. He took them gently in his. "My dear Miss Rowan, I am doing everything that a man can do. Believe me that I am. I only wish that your brother had done as he had threatened and walked into the river before he came to me." She went away at last. Deane lay back in his chair, feeling absolutely unfit for work. Twice he laid his hand upon the telephone, and twice he withdrew it. Then he turned to his secretary, who had just entered the room. "Get Mr. Hardaway upon the telephone," he directed. "I want to speak to him." In a few moments the bell of the instrument by his side tinkled. He put the receiver to his ear. "Is that Hardaway?" he asked. "Yes," was the answer. "This is Stirling Deane. You remember the subject of our conversation the other night at the theatre? I am referring now to the matter of documents of which you spoke." "I remember," Hardaway answered. "In whose possession are those documents at the present moment?" Deane asked. "In whose possession?" Hardaway repeated. "Do you mean?" "I mean, have they been sent to Scotland Yard, or are they still in that locked up room at the Universal Hotel?" There was a moment's pause. Then Hardaway answered. "To the best of my belief," he said, "they are still in the room at the hotel. They may be removed to Scotland Yard at any time, though." "No one has yet claimed Sinclair's effects, then?" asked Deane. "No one," was the answer. Deane was on the point of ringing off, but Hardaway suddenly put a question to him. "Shall you be in your office for 10 minutes, Mr. Deane?" "For longer than that," Deane answered. "I am coming around," the lawyer said. "I hope you can spare me a moment." Deane set down the telephone with a frown. Perhaps his question had been a clumsy one, or was Hardaway already suspicious? He welcomed the lawyer when he arrived a little coldly. "5 minutes, please," he said. "I have a large mail to go through and an early dinner party to night." The lawyer nodded. "I don't want to detain you, Deane," he said. "Send your secretary away for a moment, there's a good fellow. What I have to say can be said in half a dozen words if we are alone." Deane pointed to the door. "One moment, if you please, Ellison," he said. "Get everything ready for me that you can." The two men were alone. Hardaway, who had not taken a seat, deliberately drew off his glove and tapped the table with his fingertips. "Deane," he said, "have you any idea of paying a visit to the Universal Hotel?" Deane met him on his own ground, coolly and with perfect self-possession. "I have not made up my mind," he said. "It might be worth it." "It wouldn't," the lawyer said. "There's nothing haphazard about the way these things are conducted. There's a detective watching number 27 day and night." "It occurred to me," Deane remarked, "that as there is no mystery about this affair, Scotland Yard would not have thought that necessary." "It is as I have told you," said Hardaway. "At any time after to morrow the man's clothing and documents and everything belonging to him will be removed, unless they are claimed. Until they are claimed, they are watched. It wouldn't do, Deane, for a man in your position to be seen in this place, especially when one of those papers bears the name of your mine, and Sinclair has just been murdered by a man for whose defense you have paid." "That's plain speaking," Deane remarked. "It's what I came to say," Hardaway answered. "Don't do it, Deane. We are not in Africa, you know. Your methods were splendid there. They might spell ruin here. Good night." "The reprieve?" Deane asked. "A certainty," Hardaway answered, looking back from the door. "It may be a week before it is issued, but it is a certainty all the same." Deane sat in his chair, looking through the dusty window out into the court, a dull vista enough and uninspiring. Of the lawyer's words he took little enough notice. The reprieve would come, of that he was certain, but nevertheless he was beginning to feel the severity of the strain. He was a man who would have been kind-hearted but for the continual pressure of business obligations. He was a great schemer, a man of imagination and a brilliant financier. There had been little room in his life for the gentler side of his nature to develop. Yet it had been a genuine horror which he had felt, which he had carried about with him since the day he had visited the court and looked into Rowan's white face and heard those awful words of condemnation amid a silence intense, unnatural, hideous. It was a memory from which he could not easily rid himself, a memory which had penetrated even that splendid armor of indifference in which the man of toil and thought gradually encases himself. The girl's white face, too, and her plaintive eyes had touched his heart. He felt that this period of suspense was growing almost unendurable. His secretary entered the room quietly. "Did you wish me to make any arrangements, sir," he asked, "for the journey to Scotland?" Deane looked at him for a moment as a man without understanding. Then he suddenly remembered that tomorrow was the day on which he was to leave London to join the Nunneley's house party. "I am not sure, Ellison," he said doubtfully. "I will let you know in a few minutes." Once more he was alone. More impossible even than the grim monotony of the days in town seemed the thought of that prim country house, with its well-ordered days, its fashionable, easy-going crowd of people. He suddenly lost heart as he thought of Lady Olive and the prosecution of his well-ordered courtship. These things for the moment he felt were impossible. He wrote out a telegram and sent for a Bradshaw. The next day he disappeared from London. End of section 11. Section 12 of The Golden Web by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 12, Ruby Sinclair. 24 hours later, Deane walked upon the wilderness of marshy sands, glittering here and there with the stain of the sea, blue in places with the delicate flush of sea lavender. In the background, a village of red-tiled roofs. Before him, an empty sea. Behind and around, nothing but this stretch of bare, flat country, empty even of the sea until the tide should come and thrust its long arms of glittering silver up into the heart of the land. A few wandering gulls screamed overhead. From inland a great silence. Here, too, the sea, flowing in upon the level sands, was quiet and noiseless. Deane felt every nerve of his body at rest. He realized to the full the marvelous joy of solitude. All the strain of those last few days seemed to have fallen away. He looked back upon that passionate chapter of his life as a stranger might look back upon recorded happenings. The tragedy of Basil Rowan, condemned to death amid the awful silence of that spellbound court, sitting now in his cell with his head turned toward the door, passing through long hours of torture, waiting for the reprieve which might never come, appealed to him now only as it might appeal to a million others who read the newspaper. He was almost able to forget that it was he in a measure who was responsible for that episode. He was able even to forget the tragical side of Winifred Rowan's visit, to remember only her gentle, appealing ways, her passionate pleading, her gratitude, tempered still with anxiety, which had triumphed at their last interview over the repugnance which she had at first plainly shown towards him. All these doings and happenings were of another world. Here trouble and anxiety were like the noxious plaything of a race of children. The sea that rippled in so softly on the firm sands remained untroubled. The seagulls wheeling above his head in lazy content filled the air with their soothing cries. Everywhere the sunshine lay about the sea-stained places. The green marshes sparkled like emeralds. The wet seaweed, lying about in little heaps, seemed struggling to express new subtleties of color. Down one of the reaches came a brown-sailed fishing boat, steered by a man who lay at full length upon the deck, his head upon a coil of rope, one hand only grasping the tiller. A few cows were standing about in the drier parts of the marshes, swinging their tails and moving slowly from one to another of the little plots of herbage. The very smoke from those red tiled cottages went straight to heaven, unruffled by even the faintest of breezes. To Deane it seemed he had found an idyll of still life, and with a strong instinct of relief he felt the desire for sleep, so long denied him, creeping over his hot eyes. The drowsiness of the place numbed his senses. The pain ceased. He was content to forget. He threw himself upon the sands, with his back to a sandy knoll covered with weedy green grass, and with the murmur of the sea in his ears, he slept. Deane was awakened by a light touch upon his arm. He sat up and was aware of a girl bending over him. "I am sorry to disturb you," she said, "but if you sit there for another 5 minutes you will be very wet." The tide was already within a few feet of them. Deane realized the position and struggled to his feet. "It was very kind of you to wake me," he said. "I have come down here for a rest, and I suppose I was entering into the program a little too thoroughly. After London, the sea air is just a little strong." She looked at him with interest, and he returned the gaze. She was tall, almost as tall as he was himself, slim, with dark eyes, heavy eyebrows, and a complexion burnt brown by exposure to all sorts of weathers. She wore plain tweed clothes, in the cut of which his critical eye quickly detected the village tailor. Yet there was something about her appearance which seemed to remove her definitely from behind the pale of rusticity. Her eyes were long and a little narrow, her eyelids heavy, her mouth had a discontented turn at the corners. Her whole expression was a trifle sullen. He was not in the least prepared for the change in her face when her forehead suddenly relaxed, the corners of her mouth softened, and her lips parted in a dazzling smile. "You are a Londoner?" she asked simply. "Very much so, I am afraid." "Afraid?" she repeated incredulously. "Why not?" he asked. "I'm one of the slaves of the world, a man who sits in his office and toils, year in and year out. We're caught in the golden web, you see. The time comes," he continued, "when we find our way into a little corner of the earth like this, and one realizes the gigantic folly of it." "Your point of view is interesting but unconvincing," she said. "Why unconvincing?" "Have you ever thought of the matter from the other point of view?" she asked. "Thought about those poor people, for instance, who have to live in a corner of the world like this always? All these things, which rest and soothe you here, are beautiful by sheer force of contrast. For a few days, a week or so perhaps, the contemplation of them would be restful. You would lie about on the sands and in the sunshine and believe that you had found paradise. And then I think that you would begin to get just a little discontented. The sun doesn't always shine here, you know, and when the sun doesn't shine, all the land is colorless. The sea is gray and ugly, the marshes are flat and dreary, the wind, even in the summertime, is cold." He looked at her with interest. She had turned inland, walking very slowly, and he somehow or other found himself by her side, her self-invited companion. "That is rather a pathetic picture," he said. "Anyhow, the solitude remains, and when one has lived with the roar in one's brain, year in and year out, the solitude itself is marvelous." "And when one has lived," she said, "with the solitude always on one's nerves, lying about one's senses, as though one were the only living thing in a dead and forgotten world, don't you think that one may long for the roar, even as you have come here longing for the solitude?" "We apparently represent the opposite poles," he remarked lightly. "Tell me, do you live here? I presume, from the feeling with which you speak, that you are a native." "I have lived here for 9 years," she answered. "I live in a small house which you can see just behind the village there. It is very tiny, but very pretty to look at. I have lived there with an aunt who was a farmer's daughter and is very domestic, and an uncle who was invalided early in life from the Indian civil service, and who has done nothing but play golf and fish and study his constitution for the last 15 years." "You don't travel much, then?" "I have not been out of this country," she answered, "since I first set foot in it 9 years ago. I had almost given up all hope of ever leaving it until," she added, with a little sigh of content, "a few weeks ago." He nodded sympathetically. "You are going to travel at last, then?" he asked. "I hope so," she said. "I have an uncle come home from abroad, who I believe is very rich. He wrote to me the day he landed, saying that he was going to send for me to pay him a visit. I am expecting to hear from him now any day." "He's in London?" "In London," with a little sigh. "Fancy," she went on, turning towards him, "I have never been in London. Just say that to yourself and imagine what it means. The biggest town I have ever seen is King's Lynn. Have you ever been to King's Lynn?" He shook his head. "I'm afraid not." "Then you can't understand," she said. "I couldn't make you understand what it means to me to think that very soon I shall have a glimpse at any rate into the world. If I had met you 3 weeks ago, probably I shouldn't have dreamed of waking you up. I should have let you get wet and then laughed at you. If you had ventured to speak to me, I should probably have stuck my nose in the air and walked away. You see how mellowing an influence even the possibility of escape is." "What a disagreeable young person you must have been," he remarked. She nodded. They were walking side by side now on the top of a tall dyke. On their left-hand side was the creek which flowed into the village from the sea. "That is precisely my reputation," she declared. "My aunt detests me. My uncle is always irritable because I can beat him at golf. He is out playing over there now," she remarked with a wave of her hand toward the furthest stretch of the marshes. "Do you play golf?" Deane admitted that he did not. "You came here, then, only to rest?" she said. "Only to rest," he answered. "Where are you staying?" He turned around and pointed to the square stone tower which stood on the edge of the sea. "I am stopping there," he answered. "The old Coast Guard's Tower, they call it, I believe. It is the queerest habitation I have ever been in." "You wonderful person!" she declared. "How ever did you get old Pegg and his wife to clear out?" "I paid them well," he answered. "At least I didn't do it myself. My servant comes from these parts, and he told me about the place and arranged everything. I am hoping to be able to buy it." There was, as he remarked from the first, not the slightest reticence about her. She had almost the frankness of a child. "You have a servant?" she asked, looking at him with renewed interest. "Do you mean that he is here with you now?" Deane nodded. "I could scarcely be expected to cook for myself, could I?" he inquired. "He completes my establishment." "I suppose," she said, "you are a rich man." Deane shrugged his shoulders. "Wealth," he remarked, "is a relative thing." "Oh, I don't understand those fine sayings," she declared, a little impetuously. "I only know that to have money is grand, is wonderful. I would give anything in the world to be rich, to have money to spend as I wanted to spend it, and clothes and jewels and all the delightful little things of life, to go where I wanted, live as I wished, buy the things I wanted to buy. There's something hideous about being a pauper." He looked at her curiously. She was certainly, for all her frankness, a new type. Her frankness was more the frankness of a child than the outspokenness of gaucherie. "Some day," he said, "you may probably have your wish. There's your uncle, for instance." She nodded. "It is my one hope," she said, "my one hope. I go to meet the postman every morning. It is 3 weeks since he wrote and said that he was going to send for me. You don't think that he would change his mind?" she asked, turning suddenly towards him with an almost tragic intensity. "Very unlikely, I should say," he answered. "Has he any other relatives?" "None," she answered. "Even my uncle and aunt with whom I live here are not relatives of his. You see, he was my father's brother. Mr. Sarsby was my mother's brother." "It is Mr. and Mrs. Sarsby with whom you live?" he remarked. She nodded. "Yes, and my name is Sinclair," she said. "Ruby Sinclair." He stopped short for a minute in the middle of the dyke path. She was walking a little ahead, and missing him in a few moments, turned around. He was standing like a man turned to stone. "What is the matter?" she asked. "Are you tired, or aren't you well?" He recovered himself with a little effort. "It is all right," he said. "You know I told you I'd come down here to recoup a little. I get nervous attacks. I was suddenly giddy then." She came back. Her face was once more softened in the expression of kindly concern. "Would you like to take my arm?" she asked, a little timidly. "We are close to the cottage now. Perhaps you would like to come in and sit down. My aunt would be glad to see you." "No," he said. "Let us rest here for a moment." They sat down on the edge of the high grassy bank. He tortured himself gazing into her face, trying to find some likeness between her and the murdered man. There was none, he told himself, none. The name was a common one, one of the commonest. It was ridiculous to connect this girl in any way with the tragedy under whose shadow he had passed. Yet he felt his fingers nervously clutching the bank upon which they were sitting.